Hare Krishna and Pranams, dear devotees. So, thank you for joining us for our evening reading of Ocean of Mercy. So, we'll begin our session now. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Krishnaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakticharya Swami Niti Namine Snigdha Chaita Supuneta Vakilam Chara Saptam Prabhupada Dattana Nami Bhakticharya Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Krishnaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Dev Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shunavadi Vashranti Deshtarini Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare Hare Shri Gurudev Jai. Hare Krishna. So, thank you for joining us और आप सबके रिक्वेस्ट पे और आदेश के ऊपर we are starting Ocean of Mercy reading today from the beginning again. Or we have a little change also that devotees they have made some question answers. So after each chapter, we'll see how it comes. So after each chapter, we will also send you a small questionnaire from each chapter. So you just have to give like a multiple choice answers, yes, no, maybe, like that. So that is another thing we started just to revise what we have read. So that will help us. So we will start our session now, and I request devotees who want to read, please raise your hands on the app so we can start. Vijay Mataji has raised first. Okay. So it's good to have elders starting our session. So I will start. Ronnie Prabhu, can you make me allow me to do the screen share?
Yes, sorry.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Mataji.
First chapter on the road, 1945 to 1975. I was always drawn to spiritual life. As a child, I loved to sit with my mother on the roof at night, gazing up at the star-filled sky as she pointed out celestial planets and fascinated me with stories about their inhabitants, divine beings with incredible powers. I longed to go and meet them. A pious Hindu, my mother worshipped many gods and goddesses, but she taught me to have faith in Krishna and Rama, to depend on them, and call out of them when I was afraid or sad or distressed. My father was educated, progressive, and westernized, with little spiritual interest. He had found success in the pioneering stage of Indian film industry, and material property prosperity was his main concern. We lived in an affluent neighborhood in Calcutta, and though motor cars were rare in these days, my father had two, one for local transport and a jeep for outdoor work, as such shooting on location. While his while his brothers took public transport and wore dhoti and kurta, traditional Indian wear, we wore three-piece suit and was driven to work by a golf golfer. He was my hero and I was proud of him. But most of his time was taken up by his career, about which he was passionate. He worked late and I saw little of him. When I was 7, my mother contracted tuberculosis and my family was separated as to avoid contagion. My younger sister was sent to an aunt's house, and my older brother and I went to live with my father's elder sister. She was a widow whose 8 children were grown up, and she showered us with love and affection. She was also an excellent vegetarian cook who loved to serve others, and I developed a liking for her dishes. But I missed my mother. I know she was sick, but I did not understand why we would not be together. One day during a birthday party for a cousin, I sneaked out to see her. When I looked into her room, she was sitting up in bed, propped up by pillows with her eyes closed. I stood at the doorway, not sure whether to approach her, but when she opened her eyes, I could see her look of happy surprise, and she beckoned to me to come closer. She thought someone had brought me, but when I told her that I had snuck away and come by myself, she hugged me and started to cry. I laid my head on her lap, and she kissed me, tears coursing down her cheeks. Then she drew me in and held me in a tight embrace, comforting me with the warm beating of her heart. A few days later, one of my uncles came to fetch my brother and me from my aunt's. I thought we might be going to see our mother. But when we went to put on our shoes, our uncle told us not to do. I could tell that something was wrong. I didn't know what had happened, but my brother broke down crying. He understood that family members were not supposed to touch any inauspicious objects, including leather, when someone had died. We arrived at the house to find several relatives gathered, all looking grave. Upstairs, our mother was laid out on her bed, her eyes closed, flower garlanded around her neck, and colorful bouquets surrounding her body. Her face was decorated with sandalwood paste, and a bright red sindoor dot marked the center of her brow. He looked so beautiful, I thought, so peaceful, as if she was sleeping. At some point, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder and was ushered out of the room. As I entered the living room, I heard some of my relatives started to cry, but I could not look at anyone. I just stood at the window, staring out at the next door garden. That's when it all came to me. Tears streamed from my eyes, and I broke down, sobbing I would never see my mother again. My mother's passing affected all the circumstances of my life. My father lost interest in everything, even us, and stopped doing anything to earn money or maintain the household. He became depressed, feeling that he was responsible for my mother's illness and death, having neglecting her in favor of his career. Even my aunt's house was so longer and the same. She and our cousins were as affectionate as ever, but in just felt different. It was not my house. I felt it I did not belong. I had always been an excellent student and received praise for my intelligence. So the plan had been to send me to one of the best boarding schools in India, in the foothills of the Himalayas. But with my father's financial downturn, that was no longer possible, and I was enrolled instead in the local day school. It was so common. I thought so ordinary. I wanted to attend the private school where the students dressed in nice uniforms and studied everything in English, taught by teachers from England. I came abreast with the idea. I wanted to learn English and be like an Englishman, like my father had been before my mother's passing. I
Hare
just
Krishna.
could not.
Hare Krishna. Thank you,
Hare
Mataji.
Krishna. Hare Krishna. Prabhu.
Thank you, Mataji. Okay. Next we have Ronnie Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. I just couldn't generate any enthusiasm for my school or interest in my studies. As had been true at my aunt's house, I felt that it was the wrong place for me, that I didn't belong. And as a result, I failed my annual exams and didn't get promoted to the next grade. The day I found out, I sat alone in my classroom crying. I couldn't go home, I was too embarrassed. When I left school, I wandered aimlessly, eventually finding myself on the bank of the Ganges, and considering what to do. Then I noticed the railroad station on the other side of the river. That's it. I thought I would take the train on the boarding school in the foothills, promise the principal that I would be good, and beg him to let me stay. Inspired, I ran back to my aunt's. It was still afternoon, so the house was quiet, and I sneaked in through the back door, grabbed some things, emptied my piggy bank, and found more money in my cousin's drawer. Then I slipped out and dashed to the station. Seeing a young boy alone, the ticketing clerk was suspicious, but I told him that I was returning to school. When he asked why no one was with me, I said that my mother had died and that my father had meant to come with me, but he had been called away by some unforeseen business. I was used to traveling alone, I told him. I could manage on my own, so he gave me a ticket and let me pass. I used the same story on my co-passengers, and then an hour later I was heading north in search of the boarding schooling of my dreams. That night, still on the train after having fallen asleep, I was gently awakened by someone shaking my arm. When I looked up, I saw that the train had stopped at a junction and I was surrounded by a group of passengers accompanied by a police officer. This time, when asked who I was and where I was going, I didn't dare lie. When the officer heard my story, he took me to the local station and phoned my father. I didn't want to talk to him, but when the officer insisted, I took the phone and then broke down crying. After the officer explained the situation to my father, he took me to his home nearby, where his wife fed me and put me to sleep. I stayed the next day as well, almost entirely in bed. They were very nice to me, but alone in the room. I felt like a criminal who had been arrested. That night, my father came to take me back to Calcutta. There, he sat with me and we had the longest talk I could remember having with him. He told me how much he loved me and how much confidence he had in me. No matter what I had done, he said, he knew that I was a good boy and would never do anything really bad. My mother had loved me. He assured me she still did. Then he sat silently as I cried out on the agony of separation. The next few days, I just stayed in my room, unsure what would come next. My aunt was still loving and supportive, but things had changed and everyone around me realized that something had to be done. It was decided that I would be sent to an uncle in the small town of Khowai in Tripura, after about 500 kilometers east across the borders in Bangladesh. Khowai was quite little down on the bank of a river surrounded by mountains. People knew each other and seemed to lead simple, happy lives. Unlike his brother, my uncle had chosen business over education, and he had become quite successful, supplying jute to the mills in Calcutta. Everyone in the town treated him with affectionate respect. Initially, I felt that I was being sent to Kuwait as punishment for my crime of running away, but my experiences soon relieved me of such misgivings. I had come from the big city, and the local people treated me with some admiration. More importantly, my uncle and aunt accepted me as if I were their son, and I was like a big brother to their three small children. My aunt even told me that when for a long time she had not been able to have a child, she had requested my mother to give me to her, and now the Lord had fulfilled her desire. So I began to settle into life in Kauai. My relationship with my father had been quite distant since my mother's passing, but since my running off, we had become closer, and I began to feel his love for me again. He wrote to me with life instructions and expressed his love and confidence that I would succeed. He reminded me that my mother was always watching over me and she would feel proud when I had made something of myself. Things went well in Kauai and I was back on track, making friends and doing well in school. I was not very big or strong, but I enjoyed some success with athletics. I was the goalkeeper for the school soccer team and did quite well in cricket, which I loved. In my final year, at 16, I was the only student selected for the subdivision cricket team, which, other than myself, was comprised of older players, mostly government officers. Our team played well, and we even reached the finals of the inter-district tournament. Early in the final game, we were being outplayed and defeat seemed certain. But then I scored a half century, 50 runs in one innings, and won the game for my team. I was the star, and the subdivisional officer honored me in the victory celebration at the town hall. My strongest subject has my strongest subject was English. Most educated Indians, or at least most of those I knew, believed the saying, "West is the best." Although Britain's rule of India had ended in 1947, 2 years after my birth, its culture was still prevalent. As one of my teachers told us, if you want to learn English, you have to read in English, write in English, speak in English, think in English, even dream in English. And I worked diligently to follow his instruction. Unlike most of my peers, I was not shy about speaking English, and he and I would often spend hours conversing. My favorite instructor, Neeraj Babu, had been a freedom fighter in India's struggle for independence. He'd been imprisoned and brutally tortured by the British. I was told that they had damaged a vein supplying blood to his brain and that as a result he'd lost his mental stamina. He would often become exhausted and sit in pain, holding his head in his hands. But when he was able to teach, he was brilliant. It was such a contrast. He had been a freedom fighter and hated the British, but he loved their language.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you so much. Okay, next we have Shashi Mataji.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah, yeah. I loved literature and was fascinated by authors, wordplay, and stories. In addition to works by English authors, we also read English translations of works by such famous authors as Homer, Tolstoy, and Dumas. Their influence on me was so strong that although I appreciated Indian authors, I naively presumed their writings had been influenced by their Western predecessors and counterparts. Those books were great Western authors, ignited the urge in me to see that world and become a part of it. Wisdom, I felt, came not from sitting in a classroom or reading books, but from going places and meeting people. I had to go out and see the world. I could have continued my studies in Tripura, but I decided to attend a college in Darjeeling, a beautiful hill station that the British had built as their summer residence. One of my uncles was a successful lawyer there, and when I expressed my desire to study there, he happily made the arrangements. My plans was to become a scientist, so I registered for as honors degree in chemistry. But after 2 years, I was selected for a scholarship to train as a pilot, with the possibility of enlisting in the Indian Air Force, and I opted for that instead. Back in Calcutta for flight trainings, I met a group of boys I had helped in Darjeeling. They had come from Calcutta for summer vacation without making prior arrangements. And when they had arrived in Darjeeling, they had found that all the hotels were fully booked and there was no available accommodation. One of them, Tulsi Sen, had once met my cousin and had her phone number as his only contact in Darjeeling. In desperation, he had phoned her and described their situation. She had not known what to do and passed the phone to me. And after making a few phone calls, I had managed to arrange for them to stay in a guest house of a local indoor stadium, which usually accommodated visiting players. Tulsi and two of the other boys, Swapan Thakur and Gaura Ghosh, had been specially grateful, and we had become good friends. Now the boys wanted to reciprocate, and so they introduced me to their other friends and related how much I had helped them in Darjeeling. They were all from very affluent families. Tulsi's father was an eminent lawyer in Calcutta High Court. Swapan Thakur was related to the famous poet Rabindranath Tagore, and Gaura came from a family of successful industrialists. They had all been educated in the kind of school I had dreamt of attending. Tulsi introduced me to Anand Mohan, the son of the chairman of Indian Railways Service Commission, and we three became close and spent most of our spare time together. After my flight training, I was told that I was not good enough to join the Air Force. I did not have the finances to get a commercial pilot's license, so I decided to earn some money and travel abroad, as I had as I had always dreamt of doing. I teamed up with a friend, Alok Gupta, and together we started a business promoting instant coffee. When we had earned enough, he left to study in England, but although most of my friends dreamt of going there, I had my eyes set on Germany, specifically Hamburg. When I had a cousin who had encouraged me to come and pursue my studies. My choice of Germany was also inspired by a lifelong connection as my father's close friend Vidyapati Ghosh, whom we called Vidyapati Kaku, uncle Vidyapati had studied in Berlin and came back with a German wife, our Dolly Kakima. Aunt Dolly. She had a Jewish background, and persecution when the persecution of Jews had begun in Germany in the 1930s, they had escaped on bicycles, riding more than 400 miles to the Swiss border. When they settled in Calcutta, Dolly Kakima became absorbed in the local Bengali culture. She had been very close with my mother and had always treated me with affection, especially after my mother's passing. So when I heard that another of my friends, um, Prasoon, was going to Germany to study social psychology, I decided to join him. Many young people from Europe and America were traveling east in search of spiritual life. But I, like many other Indians, including my father, was attracted by the allure of material prosperity, and so I wanted to visit new places and broaden my views. Thus, in the summer of 1970s, I headed west in the opposite direction.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Mataji.
Hare
So,
Krishna.
thank you, Mataji. Next, we have Neha Jindal Mataji.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
Like many of our friends, Prasoon, am I audible? Hare
Yes,
Krishna.
Mataji. Yes, Mataji. You are audible.
And I had read and been influenced by Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So we had the idea that instead of flying to Europe, we would travel the road, hitchhiking. It would be a challenge, we knew, especially since Pakistan was off limits to Indians. But Prasoon suggested that we take a ship to Basra, Iraq, and proceeded overland from there. So we took a train to Bombay, spent a few days getting visas for countries along the way. Iraq, Turkey, Greece, Italy, and Switzerland all required them, and embarked one morning on a cargo ship from Balad Paya. After a week of stopping at what seemed like every port in the Persian Gulf, we were thrilled to land in Basra and get our feet back on solid land. I had never ventured outside India, and I was enchanted, filled with images from my reading about the Assyrian and Babylonian civilizations on the banks of Tigris and Euphrates, and the hanging gardens built by King Nebuchadnezzar to soothe the afflicted heart of his homesick queen. He had heard that there was a Sikh temple in Basra where we could stay for free, and some young local boys showed us the way. We immediately became friends with them, and they decided they would pick us up the next morning and show us around the city. We had not planned to stop for long, but we had such a good time with the new companions, seeing the college, meeting their friends, and visiting the mosques, the old Latin church, and the Indian market, that we decided to stay a few more days. In the evenings, we all sat around talking and drinking tea in the open air cafes, known as casinos. Though there was no gambling, on the banks of Shat al Arab River. 3 days later, Prasoon and I took a bus to the highway on which we would hitchhike to Baghdad. No one would stop, though, and it was extremely hot. After several hours, dejected over the failure of our attempt to hitchhike across the continent, but also relieved to be out of the scorching sun, we got on a bus. An American traveler in Basra had told us about a French church in Baghdad where one could stay for free. And when we found it, a beautiful cathedral in the middle of the city, we received a warm welcome from a middle-aged French priest. In Baghdad, as in Basra, Prasoon and I made friends quickly. We connected with a group of affluent university students who showed us the city and hosted us at restaurants, responding to our expressions of gratitude by saying, "No thanks for duty." They were fun-loving but strict Muslims, so they did not drink or smoke, and we visited them in their homes practically every day, sipping tea from small, fine gilded glasses in their large villas and beautiful gardens. One of their mothers washed and pressed our clothes for us, and when we got them back, I found that one of my socks, in which I had worn a hole, had been perfectly mended. Even with our friends' warm hospitality, however, I was determined to resume our journey. I tried to convince Prasan to come along, but he was adamant on staying back. He seemed to want to be on his own, free from my association and influence. He had left India to experience the world, he said, and wanted to take full advantage of the opportunity to spend time with our new friends. He was enjoying himself and he wanted to stay on. So we agreed to part ways. I would leave the following morning. Mark, an English traveler, Prasun, and I had met in the church, had witnessed our conversation and asked if he could join me. We had already developed an amiable relation, so I agreed. When one of our Arab friends, Ahmed, heard that we were heading north towards the Turkish border, he suggested that we visit his family in Zakho, in Kurdistan. So that was our first destination. Having found hitchhiking in Iraq practically impossible, I suggested that we travel by bus. Ahmed had alerted his friends that we would be company. So when we arrived, we were greeted by a warm reception and brought right to his house. His father, an old man with a long, flowing beard, greeted us with a broad smile. He didn't speak any English, but Ahmed's sister was fluent, and both she and his friends took great care of us.
Hare Krishna Mataji. Thank you,
Hare Krishna
Mataji.
Prabhu. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you. Next we have Preeti.
Hare Krishna. Zakho was a small town with little to see, but we were drawn in by the ruins, which were signs of a rich history and culture. Few of Ahmed's friends spoke English, but we developed a simple bond of friendship with gestures and smiles. We played soccer together and afterwards would cool ourselves in the shallow waters of the local river. Orchards of apples, pears, and figs grew on its banks, and we would sit beneath the trees and enjoy their fruits. When, after 3 days, the time came for Mark and me to move on, many of our Zakho acquaintances came to their doors to bid us farewell. After my experience in Basra, I was not optimistic about hitchhiking, but this time Mark insisted. Several of the boys walked with us to the highway, and as we tried to hitch a ride, they stood nearby watching. As hour after hour passed without success, I gave up whatever little hope I had. Finally, one of the boys got an idea, and the next thing I knew, a few of them had stopped a passing truck, spoken with the driver, and were waving at us. Somehow they had convinced him to take us to the Turkish border. As the truck pulled out, Mark and I looked back gratefully at our friends waving from the side of the road. The driver spoke a few words of English, just enough for us to carry on a friendly conversation. He was going to Turkey, to Diyarbakir, he said, and would take us there. When we reached the outskirts of the city, Mark suggested that we do not enter but stay on the road. It was already quite late, so we decided to spend the night on the roadside. I had never slept out in the open, and it was a wonderful feeling to rest on the bare ground under the star-studded sky. Our plan was to stop in Maltaya on our way to Ankara. There were two possible routes. On the map, one looked longer and the other shorter and straighter. So we decided to take the shorter one. Only after riding some distance did we realize that we had embarked on a mountainous road. But by then, it was too late to turn back. Our ride took us up into the mountains and dropped us off at what seemed like the middle of nowhere. We waited under a walnut tree on the side of a road for hours without anyone stopping. In fact, hardly anyone ever passed, and we doubted that any of the drivers knew about hitchhiking. Still, I was excited to see the interior of Turkey, and the place was enchanting. The mountains were cut from red rock, and with only sparse vegetation, a river flowed along the valley below, with banks of lush green clusters of village houses dotted the landscape. I suggested to Mark that we go down to the village and see if we could find something to eat. He said that one of us should stay on the road and try to stop a car. I offered to stay. It would not be such a long way down to the village, but I did not know how I would communicate with the people there. Why don't you go? He said with a smile. We finally decided to settle it by tossing a coin. I lost and had to go. I climbed down a winding path, but even in the village, there were no shops. I walked up to a house and knocked. A woman came to the door, but when she saw me, she screamed and slammed the door in my face. Giving up hope of finding food, I climbed back up the mountains to the road and told Mark what had happened. We sat for a few more hours under the walnut tree, shading ourselves from the sun, our stomachs burning with hunger. We discussed our mistake in taking the mountain road and considered going back to the other route. Suddenly, several boys came into view. They silently approached us with two large covered metal plates and placed them before us. When we removed the coverings, we found homemade Turkish bread, raw green vegetables, and large pieces of goat cheese. We thanked the boys profusely and then ate while they sat around watching and speaking among themselves in a language we couldn't understand. After a short while, several village women came up and sat behind the boys to watch. One of them was from Lebanon and asked whether we knew French. Mark was fluent, and we learned from her that when the woman who had shut the door on me had seen that I was climbing back up to the road, she had called to the other women and told them what had happened. They presumed that I had been looking for food, and spotting the two of us, they had sent the boys with the plates. The other residents, the woman said, had hardly seen a foreigner in their entire lives. So the arrival of an Englishman and an Indian was quite an event.
Hare Krishna.
The women,
Thank you, Manasi. Thank you. Next, we have Chandan Mataji.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. The women's hospitality was wonderful, but we still could not get a ride, and we stood by the road the rest of the day. Finally, towards evening, an elderly shepherd tending his flock spoke to us. From his gestures, we made out that he was inviting us to spend the night in his home. We happily accepted. He was a simple, poor shepherd, yet he offered us what he could, food and a place to sleep. In the morning, Mark and I decided to make our way back down the mountains to a more populous place where we had a better chance of being picked up. Once we were back on the main road, hitchhiking in Turkey was not as difficult as it had been in Iraq, and we soon got a series of short rides. Near Ankara, we were picked up by 3 English boys from York University in an old station wagon, and we rode with them through the entire stretch of Turkey and into Istanbul, where Asia and Europe met. Istanbul's Sultanahmet district near the Blue Mosque didn't look like Turkey. It was full of young Americans and Europeans. Their alternate hippie lifestyles were new to me, but most were quite broad-minded and friendly. The dormitory-style hotel was so cheap that we could afford to stay for a while, and we made many friends, including a young American, Larry Baker. Every morning, Mark, Larry, and I would go for breakfast at the Pudding Shop, a restaurant popular among young travelers, where we spent a good deal of our time. The food was delicious and cheap. But the most interesting feature for me was the atmosphere. It was alive with free-thinking youth who were open to meeting people and sharing their experiences. Some of them had been in Istanbul for months, living day to day, playing music, and just hanging out. We roamed the city, visited historic sites, and just sat and chatted on the banks of the river. One morning, Mark suggested that we go see Topkapi Palace, an hour away. I was struck by the name because, Top meant cannon in Bengali, and I was included in many Bengali names, words and names, and was included in many Bengali words and names. It was, I realized later, a Turkish word that had been incorporated into Bengali during the Persian invasion of India. Mark took the role of tour guide. The palace, which was actually an enormous cluster of buildings and courtyards, had been the seat of the Ottoman dynasty that had ruled over Asia Minor and a significant part of Europe for centuries. We spent the day there admiring the classic architecture and ornate decorations, and amazed by the sheer magnitude of the place. Mark and I had stayed in Istanbul for a full week. The day before we were going to leave, we were sitting in a park with Larry when two young men approached us and asked if we would like to smoke some hashish. Neither Mark nor I were interested, but Larry left with the men. He didn't come back that night, and the next morning, worried, we told the manager of the pudding shop. We were concerned that the men could have been police in plain clothes and that Larry might have been arrested. The manager told us not to worry. If anything, the police would frame Larry to get a bribe. Drugs were not a big deal in Turkey, unless you were caught smuggling large quantities. Larry didn't return that morning, but reassured by the manager, we posted 2 notes on the pudding shop's notice board, one for Larry and one for Prasun, then left for Greece. Like many Indian boys, I had been enchanted by Alexander the Great. My brother had told me the story of Alexander and the massive legendary horse, Bucephalus. No one had been able to tame Bucephalus, but Alexander spoke to it soothingly and turned its head towards the sun so it could not see its shadow, which had been the cause of its distress. With Bucephalus thus subdued, Alexander was able to ride it, and the horse served as his mount until it died during his invasion of India. I also loved hearing about Alexander's encounter with the Persian king Darius. Darius had a huge army, 5 times larger than Alexander's. So when he had been challenged by Alexander, whom Darius considered a mere boy, he was so confident of victory that he brought his wife and mother. But Alexander attacked him unexpectedly at a mountain pass away from the battlefield. Darius ran away, leaving behind his wife and mother, who were taken into custody. When he then offered a huge ransom in exchange for their freedom, Alexander replied that he was not interested in the ransom, but would release the women if Darius appeared before him and knelt in submission. Darius did as ordered, and Alexander set the women free. Once, when Alexander was away from his kingdom, his minister wrote to him that his mother was meddling in affairs of state. Alexander wrote back, "One teardrop from my mother's eye can wipe out all your letters complaining against her." Mark and I were headed to Thessaloniki, Macedonia's capital, near Alexander's birthplace in Pella. One of our rides was from an educated French couple who spoke fluent English, one of 3 families traveling together in 3 cars. They stopped at a beach in Alexandropolis where we all had, where we all had an ocean swim and a picnic. Thank you, Prabhu. They were the first European families I had met on the road. All the Westerners in Istanbul had been young travelers, and I found them pleasant and friendly. I was impressed by the cultured and generous attitude of the couple who picked us up, and I wondered how often I could get rides from such people. "Would you have picked me up if I had been hitchhiking alone? I asked. They paused. Then the man looked at his wife and smiled. And she said that they generally did not pick up hitchhikers at all, but that seeing me, an Indian, they had been curious.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Mataji. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Radha Mataji.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
In Thessaloniki, Mark and I stopped in a youth hostel, but to stay there, I needed a membership card, and to get one, I had to prove that I was a student. Mark and I tried to reason with the manager that no one carried a certificate while traveling, but the man was adamant. Finally, having overheard the conversation, a few young Americans sitting in the nearby lounge came up to the counter and practically shouted at the manager on my behalf, and he succumbed to the pressure. From there, we hitchhiked during the days and stayed in youth hostel at night, passing through Yugoslavia and into Italy, where we spent a few days in Venice and Milan and then stopped in Turin. At that point, Mark was supposed to head back to England and I would continue into Germany, but he changed his mind and decided to visit a friend in Dijon, France. I was already feeling sad at the thought of us parting ways, so when Mark proposed that I accompany him, I agreed, and thanks to his pleading at the border, I was able to get an emergency 3-day visa. Mark's friend Pierre was in Dijon studying at the university, and he hosted us in his apartment, which he shared with a female roommate. Their arrangement was unusual, I thought, even a bit shocking. I had not seen anything like it before. It was also my first experience of a European university. Although we had found that people in France generally didn't like to speak English, the students were quite different. Their English was not fluent, but they seemed to take an amused delight in conversing with us. From France, we went to Switzerland, and in Basel, Mark and I finally had to part. We sat in a meadow near the border, reminiscing over our days together and making plans to meet again. We embraced, our cheeks pressed tight, and then he stood watching as I crossed the border into Germany, turned and waved goodbye. My cousin Babida, his name was Babi, and Da was short for Dada, the Bengali term for one's elder brother, had been living in Germany for over a decade. He had studied engineering there and risen to become a director of a prosperous firm. His marriage to a German woman, Maria, had strained his relationship with his conservative family in India, but I found her to be very nice. I was reminded of my Dolly Kakima, who had also married an Indian man. When I told Maria that I would call her Miradi, the D being short for Didi, an elder sister, she gave me a big smile. We became close in no time, and she accepted me as part of the family. She took me to the University of Hamburg to get me admitted, and when we learned that the semester had already begun, she convinced them to enroll me as a guest student. One of the first people I befriended in Hamburg was Bill McCabe, an American exchange student from the University of Dayton. In India, I had been a member of the United States Information Service, which had a good library and promoted various aspects of American culture. One of its features was a jazz club, and every Saturday afternoon, my friends and I would listen to swing and bebop and challenge each others to identify each musician. America House, where I met Bill, was the German counterpart, beautifully located in the middle of a large garden near the university. I went there frequently mostly to read in the library, and one day Bill just walked up to me and introduced himself. He was interested in India, he said. Many of his friends had already been there and wondered where I was from. Bill introduced me to his group of friends, Chuck, Ray, Jack, Connie, and Susan, all Dayton students. My German was still not very strong, so I did not develop such close relationships with many local students, but my friendship with this group developed quite spontaneously. After staying with Babida and Miradi for a couple of months, I decided to move out on my own. The family with whom Bill was staying had another student staying with them, and when she moved out, Bill asked whether I, one of his friends, could move in. The landlady agreed, but when she learned that I was Indian, she expressed some reservations. The next day, Bill had to go to Kail, a city on the North Sea, and he didn't tell his landlady that he was going. After he had been away for 2 days, she thought that he was so upset with her because of her refusal that he was not returning. So when he got back, she said, "Yes, of course, your Indian friend can come and stay." From there on, Bill and I lived in the same house, and our bond of friendship became deeper. On Saturdays, I would cook Indian food, which he loved. After hearing his reviews, all our friends wanted invitations, but not wanting to abuse the family's hospitality, I invited them only one or two at a time. Still, the house was a nice alternative to our usual meeting place, a discotheque called the Madhouse. One Sunday during the summer, when the whole group was sitting together in a restaurant near the harbor, Chuck asked me in a rather condescending tone how many people died of starvation in India each year. His disrespect was insulting, but I tried to control my anger. Many people in the West had that misconception, but no one had ever put it so bluntly. Although I was born and brought up in India, I said, I have never seen anyone die of starvation. Oh, come on, he persisted. Everyone knows that. You don't have to defend your country's honor. After all, a fact is a fact. A reality is a reality. India is not poor, I protested. She may not be so advanced or affluent materially, but she is not poor. If she were, why would Columbus have ventured so far to find her? Why was she considered the crown jewel of the British Empire? You may claim whatever you want, he argued, but everybody knows India's poverty stricken condition. India is not interested in material prosperity, I countered, but in developing her spiritual riches, because material wealth was not her first priority. Foreign invaders found little resistance and stole all they could. What are your so called spiritual riches? That the real goal of life is to achieve emancipation, elevation to a higher consciousness. By smoking pot? No, by performing austerities, negating the demands of the body. That's just the excuse of useless bums. bums. When the others saw that the argument was spiraling out of control, they suggested we stop, but the encounter had left me wounded. Despite my protests, I was painfully aware of how ignorant I was about the heritage and glory of the place of my birth. My patriotism, I realized, was only a sentimental attachment. Although I had a deep connection to India as my motherland, I was unaware of her actual splendor and opulence.
Hare Krishna.
That,
Thank you, Mataji.
thank you.
Thank you, Mataji. Hare Krishna. Devotees, does anybody who has not read would like to read? Then please raise your hands. So, okay, Parul Patel, Mataji, please go ahead.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
The argument and my desire to establish India's greatness led me to probe deeper into my country's spiritual culture. I already knew the importance of spiritual life and was aware of the existence of the soul, but now I felt compelled to learn about life's actual nature, purpose, and ultimate goal. I wrote to my friend Hitum Malkani, whose family had a bookstore in Calcutta, and he sent me a copy of Paul Brunton's A Search in Secret India. At first, I was vexed by having to read about India's glory from an Englishman, but the more I read, the more I appreciated. Brunton was a journalist who had gone to India on assignment and while there had been drawn in by its spiritual heritage. He had met many sadhus and finally surrendered himself in discipleship to a well-known spiritual leader from South India, Ramana Maharishi. When I asked Malkani for books that described India's spiritual philosophies in greater depths, he sent me a few by Swami Vivekananda, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Paramhansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, Dr. Radhakrishna's Bhagavad Gita, and a copy of Vedanta Sutra. Over the next few years, I learned more about the real source of India's greatness, but in the process, I also became aware of a higher knowledge, the futility of material existence and the need to become free from its bondage. Why struggle to achieve something that will last at a time of death? I wondered. Better to strive for something that would lead to liberation and last forever. And as my interest in and understanding of this wisdom from India grew, my fascination with the West began to wane. What had been my life there receded like a memory fading into a dim and distant past. I had always had the feeling that one day I would leave everything behind and become a sadhu. I had thought it was just a fantasy. Probably everyone felt that way at some point, but no one knew I had gone ahead and surrendered entirely to spiritual life. But during my travels, I had experienced the pleasure of freedom, of just being present in the world, floating with time and appreciating whatever came. I felt satisfaction in simple achievements and relished meeting people who were open and receptive, being invited to their homes and sharing our thoughts and feelings as if we had known each other for years, often not getting a ride until nighttime. I would lie down in my sleeping bag by the side of the road and take rest under the stars. The following morning, I would greet the new day with joyful anticipation, not even knowing what lay in store. I began to realize that this was what I had wanted to do since childhood, venturing out on my own, seeing new places, meeting new people. In this way, my fantasy would become a reality, and I decided to see it through. Winston Churchill had urged young men aged 20 to 25 to go into the world and do things, to make mistakes and learn. His statement had made a deep impression on me, and I regretted only that when I read it at the age of 23, I had already 3 years behind. From my other readings, I understood that to take to spiritual life, I had to surrender myself to a guru, and I was convinced that I would find one in India. Bill was the first person to whom I disclosed my plan by letter. He was in America for a summer vacation, but when he received my letter, he wrote back immediately, asking that I wait until he returned. I couldn't. I knew I had to I had made up my mind and did not even reply. But he also wrote to our friends in Hamburg, and when Susan and her German boyfriend Peter heard about my intentions, they tried to dissuade me from going. All I could do was explain to them that the real purpose of life was spiritual emancipation, and that the time had come for me to strive for that goal. They eventually saw my point of view, but they insisted that there at least be a farewell party, and I agreed. So on the following Friday, we all got together at Peter's apartment. Most of our friends had attended, and toward the end of the evening, Peter asked me to tell everyone about my plans. I was already feeling sad, and as had been true wherever I had been. I had found kind, nice people and developed wonderful relationships. I could see how dearly the group valued our friendship and how deep the connections had become. Still, I could see that the relationships were short-lived. We had met, we had become friends, were about to part, probably never to meet again. I told my friends how I had always admired the West and how living in Germany had become close with people here. I had been enriched in many ways. I had become aware that despite people's physical differences, we were all closely related. But the most precious gift I had received from the West, I told them, was actually the love and appreciation that I had gained for India, for the place that I had left behind. The wisdom of India, which I had to come to the West to discover, had made me aware that the life in this world was temporary and that the actual purpose of our existence was to conquer death. I was therefore returning to my homeland to go deep within myself beyond the conscious of my body and the solitude of the Himalayas. Before leaving, I had to meet one other group of friends, hitchhiking near Stuttgart on a holiday excursion some months earlier, waiting for a ride on the Autobahn. I had heard honking. A car had stopped just past me and was trying to get my attention. When I had turned, I had seen a man get out and wave, so I picked up my rucksack, jogged over, and jumped in. The middle-aged couple in the car had started speaking to me in English, but when they learned that I could speak fluent German, they had switched over and the conversation had taken a more natural flow. I was, they told me, the first hitchhiker they had ever picked up. When I asked them why they had stopped, they said that they had noticed that I was Indian, which had reminded them of an old friend. They had lived in London for some time and had developed a nice relationship there with an Indian student. When they had seen me, a young Indian, on the road hitchhiking, an uncommon sight, they had decided to give me a lift. The husband, Walter Bean, was a customs officer. His wife, Marianne, had been a school teacher but had given up her job to take care of her two daughters, Kirsten and Estrid. Kirsten was studying Russian and wanted to become a translator. We had gotten along so well during the drive that they had invited me to their home in Brennan, and I had happily accepted. I had stayed with the Beans for 3 days, and when we had become close. Afterwards, we had been out of reach for a few months, but when I had sent them a postcard from Berlin, I had heard right back from Marianne telling me how much they had missed me and requesting that I visit. I had been so touched by her letter that I had decided to return. The second visit had been more remarkable than the first. They had treated me like a member of the family. Kirsten had even started telling me about her problems with her mother. And Marianne had complained about Kirsten's not listening to her and acting so independently. I had tried to mediate, and both of them had listened to my suggestions. Subsequent visits to Brennan had deepened our relationship even further. And when Marianne heard that I was leaving Germany, she begged me to come and see them before I departed. They were sad over my leaving, especially Marianne and Kirsten. Marianne kept trying to persuade me that I could pursue a spiritual life in Germany. I had so many appreciation for Jesus Christ, she pointed out. Why didn't I put that into practice, follow him?
Hare Krishna. Thank you,
Krishna.
Madhavi. Thank you. So we have come to the end of our reading session today. And thank you, all of you, for encouraging us to start the Seva again. I'm very thankful to all of you for coming. So we'll end the session now. Ronnie Prabhu, are we going to put the quiz today or tomorrow?
I believe we are almost done with the chapter, right?
Yes.
I think we can put it today.
So how will you put it?
So Yeah, so I am posting it here only.
On the chat window?
On the chat window I'm
Okay.
posting, as well as I'm going to share the link on the screen.
Okay. So Hare Krishna, devotees, Ronnie Prabhu we have made just to get it more engaging. We have made a small, like few questions, answers, like a quiz we made on first chapter. So he will post the link on the chat window, and he's also posting the link here. We can note it down. We won't be able to. Prabhu, who will write down such a long tongue twister?
It is not long, Prabhu. They can take a snapshot, and also it is there on the chat as well.
Okay, so he has sent the link on the chat. You can press it, or you can take a snapshot also, and then see, and you can give us a feedback. How do you like the experience of having a quiz after every chapter? So thank you, Ronnie Prabhu. So on the chat window that Ronnie Prabhu has given the link. Ronnie Prabhu also gave your number also on the chat window. If anybody has any difficulty, they can WhatsApp.
Okay, Prabhu.
So thank you, devotees. So we'll end the session now. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Dev Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashat Deshatari Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Shri Gurudev. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Should I end the?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay. Can we ask members that if they have noted, or
You
does
can
anybody need more? So if anybody wants some more time, I can keep the screen on sharing. Hare Krishna. I think we can. Okay.